Hi everyone, and thank you for joining in for this GWO Control of Hazardous Energy webinar. I can see that we had a few people write in the chat and say hello to everyone. So thank you to Elizabeth and Ryan to saying hello to everyone. And we'll just slowly get going with the agenda and the presentation for today. So if you go next slide, Virginia. So to start out with, I'll just give a short introduction to myself. As it reads on the screen, I am the training project manager from GWO who has had the pleasure of working with the Control of Hazardous Energy project here for the last 18 months or so, where I've also previously been working with Siemens Gamesa, and I've studied educational science. I'm also currently, I'm the secretary as well for the GWO training committee. So I would always encourage that now we have on our website a possibility to reach out directly to the training committee. So if you have any questions, you can go in there, or you can reach out to me by email or over the phone if you have any questions regarding the GWO training standard, the GWO training committee, or you just have some improvement suggestions overall. So Virginia, if you go next slide, that was the very short introduction about myself, because one of the key things is, of course, today that we would like to encourage an interactive webinar as much as possible, given the constraints of the format. Thank you all for joining in, and I think that will also influence a little bit of how we do it in terms of the agenda, which, Virginia, if you go to the next slide, is then the agenda that we have for today. I'll just give shortly just a brief introduction to the agenda, and then we'll have another poll to look at which one you find the most interesting, so we again can try to tailor some of the points in terms of the presentation and our dialogue towards this. So if we look at it from the top, like overall fact sheet, that's mainly just, so what are some of the key facts that we have about the training standard? What is the modules? What are the duration? What are some of the other things that we have as part of the training standard? Then secondly, it's also why was the GWO training standard developed? That will look more into sort of what was the background for it, what were some of the key aims that we're trying to achieve with the training standard, and what was entirely the need behind it. So why did we determine that there was a need for the industry and a business need for our members to develop the GWO training standard? Then we look at the structure of the training standard. That is mainly towards, so what are some of the prerequisites for each of the modules? How do they all fit together? And what is some of the sequence of it? Then there's also part of this, and which is inherent in the GWO training standard, is the connection to the BTTs. Here I used an example of the equipment list, but there's also the possibility to dive into a little bit more detail about this. And then wrapping up, we'll have some key facts about each of the modules, and also looking at if we try to create a global training standard. So when we say it's applicable across all borders, what is some of the process that the working group has gone through, but also what is it that we're trying to achieve in terms of this? And then finally, the next step and the dialogue session, which I put in quotation marks, because we would try and, of course, as much as possible, encourage dialogue, and we would love to hear your, for instance, comments, your questions, and improvement suggestions. It will still, of course, be in the webinar format, so we won't have the possibility to talk together, but we would really like to hear your thoughts, your viewpoints, and if there's anything that's missing. So you can slowly start to see that we have points reaching on it. And it looks as though for now, at least from the background of it and the process and the overall fact sheet are some of the things that stands out that you'd like to hear more about. So when we progress through the agenda, I will try and keep that in mind and focus on, for instance, when we had the background, spending a few more minutes to it. And again, I would just encourage throughout, please write down your questions, and then when we have the dialogue session towards the end, hopefully we'll have quite a long time to go through each of the questions and have some talks about, for instance, what we can do to improve when we have the first review of the training standard. So Virginia, if you go next slide. We have here the fact sheet for the CoHE training standard. You can read it here on the left side of the screen. You'll be able to see some of the key facts. Applicable across all borders, we will come back to later on in the presentation, where I'll just go into more detail about process that we've been through. What I would like to highlight here with this point is a strong duty holder support, but it's not only a strong duty holder support. We've also received tons of valuable feedback from the industry. So for instance, over the last 6 months, when the training standard has been published in a draft format on the website, we had a lot of positive and constructive improvement suggestions, be it from the duration of the training standard to some of the learning objectives, some of the learning activities that were in it, where I would personally like to say thank you very much to all who has reached out, had questions, and said this could be improved, because at the end of the day, we have a lot of brilliant training providers who have a lot of experience within this area, and we also need your viewpoints. What is it that we can do to make this an even better training standard? How can we improve it overall so that we're able to reach the goals? Because the working group has done an amazing job. This has been a very challenging project, and to reach this point has been truly impressive by the working group. But as always, it's not going to be a perfect training standard in its first version, and there will be improvement points. So again, Virginia, if you go next slide, we can have a look at the working group. So as most know, that our training standard depend entirely on the input that we get from subject matter experts. And in this CoHE project, I've been lucky enough to work with experts from the companies you can see here on the right side of the screen. And all those have done truly an amazing job by working together, by not only establishing, so what are some of the common grounds that we can find between the companies, but also what are some of the common grounds that we can find between regional and national norms and standards, and being able to work together in that entire process, because it has been challenging. And we produced a minimum training standard, because that's the minimum that we were able to agree on as an industry and between the members. And throughout this process, there's been a lot of compromises, but also a lot of positive things where the work group has done a truly impressive job in, for instance, analyzing what are some of the common ground elements that we can work together on. And if you go next slide, and also a massive thank you to the industry, because as I mentioned previously, we've got a lot of positive, constructive improvement suggestions, but we also had a really nice process where we were able to test the training standard with 4 different training providers, and those are listed on the right. And throughout this, we not only had a lot of good reflections and thoughts about what could be improved, we're always able to see what works well in the previous version, in the draft version of the training standard, and what could be improved to now the released version of the training standard. And that has been truly impressive. And now we switch to a little bit more of the background and scope of these new CoHE training standard. So when we create training standard from GWO side, we look at, of course, multiple elements in determining what is the need that we have for this training standard. One of these is, for instance, the top 25 hazards and risk, which you've seen quite a lot throughout GWO presentations throughout the time. And then here you can, for instance, see that electricity is listed on the screen in the top right corner. So part of the very initial assessment of there being a need for the GWO CoHE training standard was saying that hazardous energy, and there in particular electricity, that pose a high risk for wind technician in the wind industry. And thereby we determined that there was initially a reason to do a further analysis and see what is actually what we can determine is the need for it in the industry. So Virginia, if you go next slide. Part again to establish this entire process of what is actually the need is again where the working group spent a lot of time working together, scouring their internal companies, looking at, so what are some of the injury statistics, for instance, which we highlight here, that relates to hazardous energy, and looking at, so what are the number of incidents, for instance, and determining part of what these incidents are is that there, for instance, was a lack in terms of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that wind turbine technicians need in the industry, and thereby creating a training standard so we determine what is that we want participants to do differently based on this training standard. So if we can see there is, for instance, a connection between the incidents and and in terms of how it relates, because someone was not able to act safely because they didn't have the needed knowledge to determine what was the right course of actions, then that of course helped inform the, for instance, process of determining the learning objectives. Similar to the rest, we of course also went through the path of creating risk assessments, determining specifically what was the need for each target group, and outlining all the things that you should normally do when creating a training standard. But the working group again showed their strength by being able to collaborate on this and determining, based on, for instance, an analysis of injury statistic, what is it that we want participants to do differently after they've been to a GWO controlled hazardous energy training. And then, Virginia, if you go next slide, which then ties directly in to what is the structure of the training standard. Because, for instance, by doing this thorough analysis, the working group has been able to establish the target group for each of the 3 modules. And those 3 modules, of course, interlinked and work together, but being able to look into, for instance, injury statistics, job roles, job tasks in the industry, they were able to determine that there was a need for 3 different modules. And all of these 3 different modules, of course, have different aims and different target groups, but they all hopefully should fit together and reach the aims and objectives which was derived based on a need. So if you go next slide, yes. So when we look at how it all plays in together and what are some of the different elements and how they all tie in together, then initially the working group, and which we discussed throughout, was how do we, for instance, place a value on the job experience, and what is the importance that we have on it, because the working group, for instance, had very long discussions about what is the value and importance of people, for instance, working in a team under a qualified person. So they're working in a team with someone who, for instance, established an electrical safe work practice, who does pre-test briefing or job briefing, and getting that experience on it. To start with, in the first version, we determined that this was an optional prerequisite for instance, the electrical safety module. And thereby, again, it ties in with everything. So you can see that from the basic safety CoHE, the mandatory path is then either way split. So if you want to do the pressure fluid safety modules, you would then have to do the PCT hydraulic beforehand. Then you do the pressure fluid. And then one key point as well about the training standard is that it's a minimum training standard that complements, for instance, company-specific programs, but also company-specific CoHE trainings. So when someone is to be nominated as a qualified person, that would always be company-specific in terms of their processes, their procedures, their programs, and that entire process hopefully should be tied in with the CoHE training standard, but will always remain company-specific. Yes. Then part of, again, also this process and why we from GWO side and also the Secretariat would encourage everyone who's, for instance, doing or certified to deliver the BTT trainings to have a look at the CoHE training standard, is that there is not only a connection between CoHE training standard in terms of prerequisite, but also in terms of the equipment list that there is. So I took 2 examples out of it. So for instance, for CoHE electrical safety and BTT electrical, in terms of the system that is listed in the CoHE electrical safety, then really the only thing that's not included in the BTT electrical is a 12-volt battery. So again, part of what we would encourage is to everyone to have a look who are certified to deliver the BTT and see their possibility of creating or for instance, working towards becoming certified with the CoHE training standard. And of course, if there's anything throughout this process that you have any questions regarding about, then please reach out to me. In the case that I'm not able to answer the question, I can always get a hold of the members of the working group who are really nice people and of course are busy as well, but I'm sure if there's a constructive or a good asked question, they'll be more than happy to share some thoughts and some suggestions about it. So again, encourage everyone to reach out. Yes, and go next. Then we have some of the key facts about the modules. So if you start with basic safety CoHE, again, you can see most of the information on the screen, so I'm not going to just regurgitate that, but just looking at it, the working group placed a high emphasis on is about getting participants to act safely according to the job role. So part of the focus is, again, that we look at, so what are some of the things that they can practice throughout the training and get feedback on? So is it, for instance, being able to recognize and also avoid hazardous energies in certain situations that we know there is a chance of them, for instance, facing an industry? And it's, again, this emphasis on actually putting them in examples of situation which they might face, and, for instance, having them being able to determine, so do I need to seek out the support or the help from a qualified person in this situation, or what is it that I should do, or is it something where I'm still allowed to carry on working? Other parts of it is, again, looking at something and fundamental understanding of what is it that I need to do to be able to act safely. Can I recognize what are some of the common situations where I face hazardous energy when working in the wind industry? And yeah, next slide. And that ties in again also with the electrical safety part, because we focused again, and here there is a variation in terms of the target group. And you can see some of the target group, and I put in brackets or in parentheses a future scope of work, because it's of course a scope of work that will come later down the road when they're nominated to do so in their company. But it's to give them practice in, so how do you, for instance, lead a team? How do you conduct a pre-task briefing of something before you're about to do a task? What are some of the key elements that need to be covered as part of this pre-task briefing, getting the chance to actually try and do this? Also, what is some of the electrical safe work practice that you can use? So how can you use those to, for instance, reduce the risk of injury, so that you have a team which shows up at work in the same condition as when they leave and are safe and sound and can return home to the family? So it is a lot of focus on, again, at this point, and which again ties in perhaps with some of the on-the-job experience, that they're, for instance, able to imitate or mirror what is they've seen in experience, and how they actually get the chance to practice it and take responsibility for following these safe working procedures, knowing when to stop work, knowing how to support your team. And it's also a part of some of the objectives that I would highlight here, is that they're able to establish an electrical safe work condition. They know not only when, but they also know how to do it, and can follow the steps which are listed in the training standard. And that's, again, of course, based on a common ground which could be defined, and is a minimum training standard. So as always, there might be variations, but at least that they get the practice in how do you do it and what is being assessed in the training standard. Yes, and with the last but not least, and here there is again a tie-in with in terms of the pressure fluid safety with electrical safety, because the target group has some of the same features or some of the same characteristics. It's again where you are the ones who's leading and taking responsibility for the safety of your team. So now you are actually in the qualified role, in the sense where you get the chance to practice using pre-use checks, selecting the correct PPE. You get the chance to ensure that everyone is safe and sound, and doing the right things, follow the documentation, ensuring that everyone signs the documentation the right way, and again, taking responsibility for your team, and being able to, for instance, again, establish a safe working condition, this time with just pressure fluid safety. And one thing maybe to note, I think the working group has worked again well together, is by being able to, yes, determining what is the need that we have for this specific one, but also being able to work together and saying this is the common ground that we can find in terms of pressure fluid safety. Because like in terms of electrical standards and norms, there is more so than in terms of pressure fluids. So here the working group has truly had to work together and try and establish what is the common minimum ground that we can find in terms of this pressure fluid safety. So we'll have just a few more topics before we join in and have this question and answer session towards the end. From what we did in the beginning, part of the agenda was to look at, so how do we create the process of making it applicable across borders? And here there was a few that said they would like to hear a little bit more, so I will of course not go into complete information overload, but just give a little bit more details about this. So when we looked at how to make the training standard applicable across all borders, a key part of it was to look at, so what are some of the job roles that we have amongst the companies what are some of the tasks that they do, and what are some of the key outputs that we want. Based on these, for instance, tasks, what are then the enabling knowledge skills that they have that they must be able to do as part of this training standard. And the working group did a really thorough analysis over multiple months, looking across. So when we have a technician who comes in industry and is there any similarity in terms of the roles, but also in terms of the job tasks that they do? And part of this is then again tying it into what is some of the comparison between regional, national standards and norms. You can see here on the right side, we had a comparison made, which was part of the released analysis that we did, which was shared amongst the GWO members. And there it was a focus on, for instance, what is the similarities in terms of the listed roles for the EN 5110 and the NFPA 70E. And just seeing what are some, in terms of this small table that we have here, what are some of the similarities and where do they differ? And then how can we, based on these similarities, but also the differences, determine what is the minimum common ground that we can agree on? And a lot of it throughout this process, of course, was extremely tedious. And I think also, of course, there were naturally frustrations amongst the working group, because part of it was simply to determine, here is the common ground that we can find, then setting off almost a hearing period where it would be sent out to within the companies. Everyone would go back and analyze, see what do we agree to, what don't we agree to as a company, and then bring it back into the working group. So it was almost like working in the UN for a long time, where it was trying to always find what can we agree to, what is the common ground, and then all of a sudden, where we were just about to find the common ground, someone would come back, oh, I don't agree with this point. But in the end of the long run, we managed to get it done, and we managed to find and complete this analysis, which was truly amazing work by the working group. Yes. So when we look at the last topic that we have is this next step. So we have released the training standard on Friday, along with this refresher. And then in a year from now, as mentioned, we will have the first review of the training standard. And in that review, of course, there will be some mandatory elements that needs to be reviewed. So has there been any changes in terms of the risk assessment? Has there been any changes in terms of the job roles that we can find amongst the companies? But we also need your feedback and your improvement suggestions and your thoughts in terms of what could be changed potentially. So if there is anything, you're of course free to reach out to info. You can reach out to me, or you can reach out on our website under the training committee, and there will be the possibility of having feedback directly or as directly as possible to the training committee regarding, for instance, the CoHE training standard. And again, it's the first version of it. The working group has truly done an amazing and a very, very long road they've been on to get this done. But it's the first version, so it won't be perfect. There will be things that we need to work upon and improve, and there we need your feedback, so it becomes the best possible version of the training standard. Yes, and now we go to a little bit more